Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session, Successful Authors Know Their Business. I would now like to introduce today's presenter, Keith Ogorek. Keith is the president of the Author Learning Center and the author of 3 self-published books, A Clear View, Eli the Stable Boy, and 7 Secrets of Successful Self-Published Authors. In addition, Keith has been a featured speaker at the Singapore Writers Festival, the Havana Book Fair, the Greater Los Angeles Writers Society, the Florida Writers Conference, and many other industry events. Welcome, Keith, and with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Margot, for that introduction, and I appreciate everyone joining us today. Depending on where you're calling in from, it could be a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. One of the things that I always appreciate about the ALC is we're able to impact and reach authors literally from all over the world. I don't know where people may be calling in from today, but it's not unusual for us to have people from the UK or Europe or Canada, all over the United States and Australia. So if you're one of those people, we know you're making a sacrifice of time particularly, and we're so grateful that you could be with us today. Before we get started on actually the meat of the presentation, I thought it would be helpful for you to understand how this presentation came to be. As Margot referenced in the introduction, I've had the opportunity to speak at the Florida Writers Conference a number of years. And I had spoken 2 years in a row, and I'd gotten to know the faculty chair, the person who decides who speaks and who doesn't and what topics they want to speak on quite well. And so fortunately, what I had delivered for them was well accepted and helpful to the attendees. So they asked me back a third year. And the faculty chair's name was Vic. And so he invited me back to come and speak a third year. And in my conversation with him, I said, Vic, here's some topics I could cover. I said, but before I do that, let me ask you, is there a topic that you've always thought, boy, this would be a great thing for us to present at our writers conference, but have never really had someone come forward with that topic or never had anyone who basically you felt was equipped to present that topic? And without hesitation, he said, yeah, absolutely. He said, one of the things that we want to help writers and authors understand is actually when they are actually entering into the book publishing world, they're actually creating a business. And there are specific business aspects to being an author that they often don't understand. So I said, let me give that some consideration. And so he and I went back and forth, and out of that actually was born this presentation that you're going to see today. And the first time that it was presented was a few years ago at the Florida Writers Conference. It was very well received there, and so we've continued to periodically offer it to our membership here on the Author Learning Center. But I think that that moment of inspiration is important here because this particular conference is one of the larger, if not the largest statewide conference that we're aware of. It's always been very well run and always has a really great faculty, and their faculty chair is very, very knowledgeable and a very experienced board. And so for him to identify this topic, I thought was really interesting and helpful. And so I'm excited again to have an opportunity to present this to you today. So as I said at the outset, what most authors don't understand is when they're actually going to enter into the book publishing world, they're actually creating their own company. So you may have not thought of yourself in that way, but you now are both an author and the CEO of your own company. You've been promoted. And so as you think about the CEO, what I thought would be helpful to do is identify the different departments, if you will, or different things that you need to consider as you launch your publishing and author business. The first area that you need to give consideration to is the matter of legal content. So one of the things that you need to think about is ownership of content and permission to use. So if you're self-publishing, you're actually owning the content. And then but if you work with a traditional publisher, you're actually assigning the rights for them to do something with the content. Permission to use is important because you want to make sure that as you're using content, if the illustrations are not done by you or the photos are of other people or their quotes and excerpts, that you give and cite the proper things for people. So for example, on illustrations and photos, you typically need releases. And depending on who you're working with, whether it's a traditional publisher or self-publishing company, they'll be able to help you get the proper releases. And then the other thing you need to be in consideration of is libel and slander, particularly if you're writing a memoir or a true story. You'd be surprised at how people have actually taken other authors to court because they felt like something misrepresented them. Again, depending on what self-publishing company you're working with or traditional publisher, they could vet your content for that. But you'll need to be very aware of that. And I'll give you one specific example. It wasn't that long ago. One of our members was writing a book. It was based on his personal history. And unfortunately, the house he grew up in, it was not a happy marriage. And his mom nor his dad would deny that. But he made this statement in the book, and he was required to get a release from his parents just because some people might have, in other circumstances, if they disagreed with that or felt like it was portraying them in the wrong kind of light, that they could be, be slandered by that. So particularly if you're writing that kind of book, you want to be careful. So anything that's based on true stories or things like that. Then the other thing that people often ask about is using a pen name, and this usually ties back to when you are doing things related to maybe a memoir or something. And I'll just make this general statement. Pen names are usually necessary if you are writing if you're J.K. Rowling or Stephen King and you're writing in a completely different genre and you want people to think that you're someone else. Now, eventually that gets divulged, and J.K. Rowling nor Stephen King, who both used pen names, have been able to hide behind them with the other work that they've published. However, if you're going to publish your own work as self-published and use a pen name, the one thing you need to give into consideration is it will greatly limit your marketing ability. You typically won't be able to use your photos, any photos of yourself, because you would be able to be identified. It can limit your social media, and it certainly would limit your public appearances, because people would obviously realize someone would know perhaps your real name or know who you are. So if you're going to use a pen name, you really need to give consideration as to how you might limit yourself in the ability. But these are all things that you need to consider as part of your legal. And then in terms of rights, one of the things you need to be aware of is that when you have a book, you actually have the opportunity to provide publication rights to many different formats and many different geographies. So if you're working with a traditional publisher, you don't necessarily have to assign all your rights to them. You can hold back certain geographies or other foreign translation rights. You can also hold back development rights. So if you self-publish, you own all your content and you control these. But it's not simply an all or nothing proposition. So development rights are if you want to adapt, if you think your book might be adapted for television or for streaming or for movies or something like that. So those things are all really important to keep in mind and just to be aware of. And there are some classic examples. One of my favorites is there's an author by the name of Hugh Howey who self-published a series of books, and one of his books, I think it was the 8th in this series, was the book Wool, and he had done very well with it as a self-published book. It was the 8th in this series, so he had worked really hard to build up a fan base. But in the end, he ended up giving the print rights to a traditional publisher, but he retained the digital rights. In addition, he retained the film rights and assigned those. And I believe, last I heard, his film is still there's a film under development based on his book. Now, obviously, everything in Hollywood right now is on hiatus because of COVID, but nonetheless, it's out there. So just to be aware that when you publish content, you have a number of responsibilities to make sure that you own it and give proper accreditation to people, but also you have opportunities to take all these things and convert them into other opportunities. The other thing is, legally, you want to make sure you understand the contracts you're doing. So if you're going to use vendors, if you're going to use someone other than one company, you want to make sure that you understand the agreements that you're entering into. So what are they going to deliver to you by what date, and what are you going to pay them for? And then again, you want to make sure if you're hiring an illustrator or you're hiring a photographer or something like that, that you have the rights to use that content appropriately. If you're going to pursue a traditional publishing contract, you're probably going to need an agent. And so you want to make sure you understand the responsibility and agreement that you have between the agent. How will they help you? What will they deliver for you? And what expectation will they have to be compensated for that? In many cases, you may want to consult a lawyer, or there's an organization called the Authors Guild, which traditionally can help authors who have contracts particularly with traditional publishers understand those things, and they've been around for quite some time. They're a bit of an advocacy organization for authors as they understand things, although it's fair to say that the world is definitely changing for authors and publishers right now. All right, so that's the first area that you need to think about. And the next area that you need to give consideration to is finance. So you have the legal department reporting to you, and now you have the finance department. So one of the considerations you need to give, and this is where you'll want to consult maybe with an advisor, is if you set up your own publishing enterprise as its own LLC, or you just keep it as an individual. All of these things has implications for taxes. So you need to be clear, and this is where, again, we advise you get some counsel, but what can you deduct as an expense? In most cases, if you are driving to a presentation and you're going to sell your books there, you're driving to a book signing, you can actually deduct the mileage because it's part of your opportunity to generate revenue. And then you also want to be clear on what you're going to do on your tax withholding on royalties. This is an area that a lot of authors miss. They'll often accuse companies of holding back royalties or stealing royalties, but the reality is if you don't file the proper W-9 paperwork, or I believe it's a W-8 if you're an international author working in the US, the company is obligated by IRS regulations to withhold, I think, up to 30% of your royalties. Might even be more. I'm not sure exactly the amount, but it's a significant chunk. And if not, if they don't do that, they will be subjected to penalties. So you want to make sure that you do that and make sure you file the paperwork appropriately with whoever is paying your royalties. And then the other thing you'll want to give consideration to is in some states, as you sell books, you may be required to pay sales tax or charge sales tax and pay sales tax. So you just want to be mindful of that. In some locations, they will definitely check to make sure that you're doing that. So again, it's something to be mindful. For that, you'll need to make sure you do the appropriate reporting and things. And then if you work with a traditional publisher, you will often get an advance. And so that's just simply payment ahead of royalties that will be earned on your book. And depending on how experienced you are, depending on what they project the number of sales for the book to be, depending on the topic, advances can be either small or somewhat significant. But those advances are paid ahead of royalties because royalties will be earned, and then initially the advance will be paid back from those royalties, and then after that advance is paid back, then you continue to earn royalties. And one of the key things you want to consider is how are royalties calculated? This seems to often be an area of confusion as well for authors. So there are fundamentally two different ways. There's a little complexity off of each of these. There's branches off of each of these, but there's two different ways that you can calculate. Number one is net. So net is simply they take the price that the book was sold for and they subtract the appropriate expenses like printing and distribution fees, and they'll subtract any returns. And out of that, then you'll earn your royalty. Another way that sometimes royalties are calculated are what they call SRP, which is the standard retail price. So there are some offerings where if the book is, I'm just going to use this as an illustration, if the book sells for $20 and your royalty is 10%, you'll earn 10% of that $20 no matter what the retailer sells it for. Now, ebooks and audiobooks can have slightly different calculations, but generally understanding this fundamental basic principle of net versus SRP is really helpful so that you make calculations appropriately and you set expectations. I see a lot of authors getting confused by royalties because they fundamentally don't have a really good understanding of how the royalties are being calculated. And that I think is going to be really important. Now, if you work with a traditional publisher, your agent will also be compensated through those royalties and advances, and that will all be laid out in the contract that you have with the agent. Just be clear on that when you're entering into it. And there are standards and ranges that agents will be compensated. And so you can find out for sure where those are. And the agent also could be a lawyer in this case. But you want to understand when and how those royalties are paid as well too. So some people pay quarterly, some people pay once a year if it doesn't hit a threshold. But all of these things are things you just want to enter into with some knowledge before you jump in. Because a lot of times what I have seen is authors are so focused on getting their book done, so focused on writing, and so focused on getting the book done, they don't pay attention to these details. And then down the road, they're either surprised or they're misunderstanding what was maybe communicated or not communicated, and it creates a lot of trepidation that could actually be avoided if you just understand these things before you enter in. Again, any reputable traditional publisher, any reputable self-publishing company will all make this stuff very visible. It's just something you want to give yourself to. And it's completely understandable when you're writing a book and you're publishing a book, there's so much focus on getting the book into the market that sometimes these details can be pushed aside. But it's worth it just to understand them just to make sure you know exactly what you're doing, and it will set appropriate expectations down the road. All right, so now you have a third department that's reporting to you. We've already talked about things you need to understand legally, some things you need to pay attention to with finance, and now there's marketing and PR. So as we talk about marketing and PR, a lot of times people think, well, I just need to hire a bunch of people, and certainly professionals can help you. But the reality is the most effective marketing plan is you with a plan. And too often people don't have a plan as to how they're going to go about that. And so one of the things that I would point you to, and we put this as a reference on the resource sheet, is a webinar that I do specifically called the POEM method of book marketing. And that webinar has proven to be very helpful to a lot of authors. I've presented it here on the ALC and presented at a number of writers conferences. But effectively, it is a framework for you to think about your marketing. So every integrated marketing campaign has 4 elements to it: publicity, online, events, and multimedia. And what we do is we give you a system for you to think about a way to do your marketing using this methodology. And again, I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining this because you can find the reference on the Author Learning Center that will explain to you exactly how it works. The other thing that you really want to work on very early in your process is your elevator speech. And your elevator speech is, the 2-minute, if you think about it, trailer for your book. What's your book about? But it's not just, don't tell me the story. Tell me why I would want to read it. If it's a fiction book, give me something that would make me want to understand what's happening in the book, what's at stake, who's the characters involved, and what's going to happen with them. If it's a nonfiction book, help me understand what I'm going to benefit from by reading your book. What am I going to get from it? Because what I find is too often authors start talking about their book and unfolding it from like chapter 1 through chapter 3, and people don't have time. You need to think about your elevator speech as though it were a trailer. And the reason elevator speech is a term that's often used is because it's the idea that if you get on the elevator and you're going to ride down from the 18th floor to the first floor, that's all the time you have to tell people to get them excited about wanting to read your book. We have lots of information on the ALC about how to craft a really good elevator speech, but this is really important, and it will create opportunity for you, not just in terms of selling your book, but if you are in a situation where you're pitching the possibility of doing an interview on radio or a blog or in a newspaper, or you're pitching a bookstore as to why they should help you or do a book signing with you. Once you really hone a really good elevator speech, you have an opportunity to use it in multiple things. And then don't ever underestimate the power of word of mouth. So even though there are such great platforms that allow us to reach people through social media, and there's video content and all that, still one of the most effective ways to reach people about books is through word of mouth. Oftentimes people will say, hey, you need to read this book, or I'm reading this book and I'm getting a lot from it. That's why it's so important for you to take advantage of as many opportunities as you can to get your book in the hands of readers. Because if readers like your books, they're not going to be silent about it. They're going to tell other people about it. I find in my own family that many of the books I read are books that have been recommended to me by either my wife or my daughters or friends. In fact, I have a stack of books on my desk right now that I'm slowly working through. And even before I got ready for this webinar, I looked at about half of those were books that someone has said, hey, you ought to read this book. This is a really good book. And so that's why it's so important for you to take opportunity to get your books into the hands of readers and let them do some of the work for you. And then the last thing I would say about marketing and publicity, and actually, if you don't follow the Author Learning Center on Facebook, you should do that, because today we actually posted this as a graphic on the Author Learning Center Facebook page. Marketing that's going to be effective for you as an author and for your book is more like irrigation than a thunderstorm. This is one of the things that I see too many authors do. They get really excited once their book comes out and they do this big splash, and then they don't do anything for a long, long time, and maybe they'll appear later. But what you want to do, and what I've seen in terms of authors being successful, is you're better off doing a little bit over a long period of time than you are just trying to do a big thunderstorm and do a big event. And I've seen authors who are extremely effective do this. They start maybe with 0 Twitter followers, but they set a schedule as to how they're going to get about, creating a following and helping others tell others about their book. And again, I'm going to reference a resource on the Author Learning Center. There's another webinar we do called the 3 Phases of Book Marketing. Actually, if you just go to the Facebook page for Author Learning Center, we put that link in the post today. But you can learn a lot, and we actually have a handout there as to how to create a social media schedule for yourself as well too, so that you continue to do things like irrigation more than a thunderstorm. All right, so that's 3 out of 4 areas that are reporting to you. You've got 2 more that you need to be aware of and concerned about. The next one is sales and distribution. And this is the one that is the most fun, and this is the one that people tend to jump to immediately because everyone loves to hear the cash register ring. But but I intentionally put this as the last one so far, or the 4th one so far, because you really need to pay attention to those other ones to make sure that you get the right sales and distribution. So one thing you need to be considerate of is the formats that you have, because sales formats determine sales opportunities. If you just have ebooks, that will limit your author base. If you just have paperback, you might limit your author base. If you don't have an audio book, that may limit your author base as well too. I mean your reader base. So you always want to, as much as possible, get your book into as many formats as possible. Another possibility is actually seeing international opportunities to see your books translated into other languages. Those would be considered another format as well. And you'd be surprised if your book gets enough traction, there might be someone from another country that would have interest in translating your book. I just spoke with an author last week, and it was very interesting. Yeah, he had a book that he wrote in English. It was particularly about a French person, and he actually, the reason I was calling him is actually there was a Hollywood production company interested in seeing if his book was available for possible adaptation. But as I spoke to the author, what he realized is there was value in actually creating a French version of it because it was about a French person. And so he engaged a couple friends of his. He himself was a French teacher, and they translated the book into France as well. So the book is being sold in English and in French, and so it would be considered a different format. Books used to be a planned purchase, and now they're a spontaneous purchase. So you want to make sure that your book is available in as many places as anyone would want to buy it in any format they want. Make your books available for the reader to buy no matter where they're at. And then the other thing to be aware of is that there are more opportunities besides bookstores, particularly in this environment we've been in with COVID. Bookstores have slowly started opening up, but for the most part, they've been closed for the better part of months. So if you are fully dependent on bookstores as your main distribution channel, you really would have struggled over these past few months. So you can think about other outlets that there might be that your book could sell. There's different books that I've been made aware of that are appropriate for hospital gift stores, or there was one book in particular that I was fascinated by that an author did. He's written a history of the inaugurations. So anytime there's an inauguration that takes place, which is every 4 years, a presidential inauguration, he updates his books. And that book is sold at the Smithsonian. He sells he sells it every 4 years, basically. I'm sure he sells some in between, but he sees a big rush anytime there's an inauguration. And so I know he sells at the Smithsonian and different places like that. around the inauguration that always takes place in Washington, D.C., regardless of the party, regardless of the president who is actually taking office. And he's done that for some time. So I always thought that was an interesting thing to do. And then there are all these other places that you can think about: libraries, community groups, schools, gift shops, churches, depending on your genre, depending on your book. Definitely think about all these different places that your audience for your book might gather, and those might be places that you can sell your book. I've got lots and lots of examples of authors who've just really done an amazing job of finding places where they can sell their book besides just a bookstore or the traditional outlets, and they've done very, very well with it. And the value for that is because then you put your books into the hands of readers. What I often tell authors is, if you can get your books initially when you're out, when you first come out, into as many people's hands as possible, that's how you're going to get some sales momentum. Because if they like your book and they think it's valuable, they're going to tell other people about it. They may buy some copies and give them to people. And so you want to make sure that you do as many things as you can to get books into the hands of readers so that they can use their word of mouth and their community to talk about your book. All right, we've got one more area to cover, and then after that, we'll start to take some questions. And this is an area that maybe you haven't given too much consideration to, but actually we just did a webinar on this idea of product development. And so once you have content, you have the ability to create other opportunities to generate revenue. We just did a webinar with Kathy Fyrock. In fact, Kathy's on this slide, and she just did a whole webinar on how you take your content and create other opportunities. Another person you'll see featured on the slide is a woman named Nancy Levin. And again, because of the position I'm in, I have the great benefit of knowing these authors personally and knowing their stories and know where they've come from. And I can tell you that both Kathy and Nancy started out just like you, perhaps, with not a big platform, with not maybe even the idea that they would become an author. In fact, Nancy's first book was actually a poetry book. And then this next book that she wrote, Jump, actually was self-published and got picked up by a traditional publisher. Kathy is a presenter for us, a regular presenter, and she just, as I said, has done just a masterful job of actually living out this very thing that we're talking about. So once you have a book, you open up opportunities for revenue. As I said, you've got book signings outside of stores. And I always say, think outside the bookstore. What other places can you do book signings? You have the ability to write a series depending on what kind of book your first book is, right? Usually your first book could lead to other ideas, or as you get feedback from readers, you may find an area to go to. So there's a really well-known iconic business book called Good to Great. And if you know the history on that book, the first book was called Made to Stick, and it was about companies that just had done a really good job of sustaining themselves. And out of that, the author Jim Collins would hear feedback and say, okay, well, that's interesting if we can create a sustainable business, but what about companies that are just good? What have they done to go from good companies to great companies? And so Collins actually put his research team together, and out of that book was born. And that's a great example of where the first book created a following and creating an audience, but he listened to his readers, and out of that created a second book. And I think the second book, Good to Great, was even bigger than the first one. So it doesn't have to be just a fiction book. It could be a nonfiction book. You also could look at the opportunity to do audiobooks, and that's becoming more and more prevalent. There might be merchandise based on your book, and merchandise, could be the typical things that people think about, t-shirts and things like that. But I know someone who's a life coach who created some things around anti-stress. And then the other thing too is maybe you create a workbook out of that. You can do speaking engagements or presentations. When you have a book, it changes how people think about you. Years ago, when I first started working with authors, there was a gentleman who had self-published a couple books. He's gone on since then and done, I think, 6 or 7 total. But I remember very early on, he said to me, there's a certain cachet which comes with being an author. And I didn't fully appreciate what he meant at that point. But what he was trying to say is when you become an author, it changes the way people think about you, because I think anyone who's had an idea for a book and attempted to write a book realizes how difficult it is to actually accomplish that task. And so when you write a book, you actually and finish a book and publish a book, people will think of you differently. And so it could open up opportunities for you to do speaking engagements and presentations. And again, much in the same way that you need to think outside the bookstore, you can think about all kinds of opportunities in your community or in professional groups or schools or churches or synagogues or anywhere where your book might be relevant. And then if you really want to take advantage of this, and it's interesting, again, this presentation was first crafted, I think, 2 years ago, but the ability to do webinars and online classes is absolutely, very, very much an opportunity these days. I mean, the whole world has kind of had to move there because of the COVID situation we're in, but certainly even as we're on this webinar here, it gives you an example of how you could create something that could deliver value to people. And then as hopefully things loosen up, you can do in-person workshops. And that might be things that you do with a smaller group. And then out of that, you may actually consult with individual clients. And I've seen authors just follow this pattern very successfully once they have a book. Again, it's going to take extra work, but a lot of authors will make significantly more revenue from these outside activities than they will their book itself. But the book gives them these things. Nancy has gone on and done another book for sure. She may have two after this, but she's done at least one more that I'm aware of. And Kathy just continues to be very successful at helping authors or helping speakers, create the kind of books that they need. So these are two great examples. And again, there are many others I could share with you, but all of these things are very possible once you have a book. So there you have it. You've now got your new company, and you have these 5 areas that you need to give consideration to: legal, finance, marketing and PR, sales and distribution, and product development. And as Margot referenced at the beginning, and you want to be clear on what you can do and where you need help in each of these areas. As the CEO, you don't have to do everything yourself, but there are resources that you want to take advantage of. And here's some other helpful resources. As Margot mentioned, we have provided for you a resource page in this webinar that you can download, and it will link to many of the topics that I've talked about in more detail, because this is meant to be an overview, not specifically, diving deep on each of these, because we have resources on that. I had already referenced the Authors Guild. If you're going to enter into any kind of agreement with a traditional publisher, they can be a helpful resource. And then there are 2 books that I would commend to you. One is by a woman named Kelly Notoris, and this is her book is titled "The Book You Were Born to Write." She gives just a lot of really helpful tips on what it takes to actually get the book that you have in you out on paper if you're struggling with that. And then a second book that I would commend to you is a book by Mike Hyatt. Mike at one point was the chairman and president of Thomas Nelson. He's subsequently gone on and formed his own company. And this is the first book that he wrote out after his days at Thomas Nelson, but it's called Platform: Get Noticed in a Noisy World. And Mike talks about just the very, very specific things that he did starting from zero to build a social media following. And so it's very tactical, and it's very specific about how do you go from nothing to something. And obviously Mike's just done a good job. Again, one of the great blessings and benefits of this role that I have and what we do at the ALC is I know these people personally. Everyone I've talked about today, I have the privilege of knowing them personally, and they're just really, really, really smart people, really good people, and really interested in helping. So all of these things are resources above the ALC that you can look to. So, all right, with that, Margot, let's turn it over to any questions that we might have.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, Keith. The first question we have up is, can you tell us about the benefits of an author blog and how an author can most effectively promote their work on a blog?
Yes, and I think this will be a default answer for me on a lot of things. We have so much good content on the ALC about how to create a blog. Margot, you'll have to help me because I can't remember all of them. I think we just did a webinar not too long ago with Eric, right? Was it Eric that we did one with? Does that ring a bell?
Yes,
Anyway,
I'm looking through our archive now to find it.
yeah. So we'll post some things, or Margot will post some things. So a blog is helpful because a blog allows you to connect with readers that are interested in your content. And so um, and so the blog also allows you to connect to people who can influence. So what you want to do is you want to, as in all things, you want to set a regular schedule. So you don't want to do a blog 1 month and then not do a post for another 3 months. You want to set up a regular schedule that you can commit to, whether it's every week, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. And then you want to do three things with that blog. You want to write content that's relevant to the content that you've shared in your book. Sometimes that may mean you excerpt things. Sometimes that may mean you write something that was prompted by something that you wrote in your book. So that's the first thing. The second thing you can do is you can offer the opportunity to guest blog or to repost blogs from someone else. So if you have someone who's writing a blog that's similar to the content that you're doing, you might offer to guest blog for them with the reciprocal offer that you'll allow them to guest blog, or you will repost content from their blog with their permission. And what that does is it widens your audience. And you're, in the end, as I said, you're trying to make as many people as possible aware of the content. And so it helps you create opportunity to connect with readers that are relevant to your content. Plus, it helps you build your profile as not just a book author, but someone who might be an authority on a subject, or someone who, if you're writing a poetry book or a romance book or something, it changes your profile. It adds to your profile as well too, and it gives people more opportunities to connect with you. And then the last thing I would tell you is it will help you in your search results. We have a webinar coming up on how to do SEO, which is search engine optimization. And one of the keys is you want to have content so that when people search your name or search your title, you come up in the results. And the more you blog and understanding how keywords work in those things and metadata, you'll come up in more results. So Margot, did you find the resources?
Yes, and I've copied links into the chat pane. So if you go over to your training panel and click chat, you'll see the blogging webinar and the upcoming webinar about SEO, which are both from Eric Deckers.
Yeah. And Eric's, again, just a great presenter. He's written books about this topic. So I think if you can make time to listen to that, he'll give you way more information and actually tell you how to get from sort of step A to doing it. So
Yeah, great. So before we move on to the next question, Keith, I just wanted to share a comment with you that we have in the questions pane from
okay.
Mary M. Because you just mentioned how we have people from all over the world, and Mary is calling in today from Nairobi, Kenya.
All right,
Okay.
Mary. I'm so glad you can join us. I'm trying to imagine what time it is there. I suspect it's at least 6 or 7 hours, if not more. So it's in the evening for you. So that's great. Welcome.
And so we have David Yu from Mexico City. So just to share those.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. So next up for questions, you talked about adapting a book into different formats. And two of the most popular options for this are ebooks and audiobooks. So which of these two do you think is the more worthwhile venture to explore first?
So I would definitely do ebooks first, and the reason is because that's going to probably be the most cost effective and easily distributed. Audiobooks are a great resource, but they take a little bit more production. And so if you've got a print book in format, you can adapt to ebooks pretty quickly. So I would definitely do that one first. And then I would look to see what kind of following you get for your book and what interest you get. And if your genre is a genre that does a lot with audiobooks, and then I would look at that one.
Okay, thank you so much. For our next question, the disclaimer that you are not a legal expert, but we have someone wondering about they wanted to use an Einstein quote to start a chapter of her nonfiction book, just to find that she was not able to use that quote. So do you have any idea why that might have been the case?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to put the disclaimer on here that I'm not giving legal advice, but what I can tell you from practice is there are some things that are in public domain, and there are some estates that protect things very tightly. And there isn't any necessarily a hard fast rule. I'm not familiar with Einstein's estate. They may be protecting that in some way. And then there are things that are in public domain that you have no problem using it. And so that I think is the answer. I know that there are certain authors whose estates have been very protective of their material and how it gets used and all of that. And then there's others, like I said, that have moved to public domain and you can use it without any problem. We see this same issue when it comes to using versions of the Bible for those who might be quoting Bible verses. There are certain versions of the Bible that are in public domain and you can use without any problem. And there's other versions that are copyrighted and you need permission to use. So unfortunately, I can't speak specifically to the Einstein case. I can just speak to the general thing that I've seen. And sometimes I've been surprised by who's protecting their content versus who isn't. So, and Einstein may have fallen into that category. I can't say that for sure, but I've seen that before.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have a question about audiobooks. So we have someone wondering, should they hire voiceover talent to do the audiobook, like professional talent, or should they record it themselves? And especially because the book that they've written is one about their personal experiences. So they're not sure which option to go with.
Well, Margot, isn't that an interesting question given what you and I were talking about before we got onto this webinar?
True,
So
yes.
So, so one of the things, so I'm going to embarrass Margot here. The ALC team just thinks Margot has a great voice, a great radio voice. She has such a great voice for these webinars. And we were actually just talking about how there are some people who do audiobooks that you just can't listen to them. And so I guess it's relative to what your voice sounds like. And so what I would do is I would record some things and ask people what they think. Some people have nasally voices, some people have very gruff voices, some people don't enunciate, some people may have heavy accents, and none of those situations would make it pleasant to um, listen to you. So if you have the kind of voice, so what I would tell you is if Margot was going to tell me she was going to record an audiobook, I absolutely would tell her go ahead and do it because I think she has a great voice for something like that. But without hearing your voice and knowing how it would work, then the other thing too is I would listen to a few audiobooks and listen to audiobooks that you like and listen to the way that they deliver them and just give an honest assessment. Can you deliver that way? Can you enunciate? Can you put in the pregnant pauses that sometimes create drama, right? Most people who read audiobooks don't read them just straight through monotone. They put a little bit of drama to it. And so if you can deliver that, then there's no problem with you doing that. But if you can't deliver that, be honest and hire a professional talent who will actually deliver your content in a much more pleasing way.
All right, great. And thank you so much for that shout out. Um,
Yeah. And just for the record, Margot is not for hire for audiobooks. So
Thank you. Next up, we did have a comment after that, Sharu. They are calling in from Sweden. So again, just all
love it.
different parts of the world
Love it,
today.
love it, love it.
Yeah.
Think about this for everyone on this call. What I often say, and Margot and the ALC team has heard me say this a million times, but writing is a solitary activity, but the journey to being an author doesn't have to be. And so, and one of the great things about the ALC is we're able to connect authors from all over the world. So just on this call, we've got Nairobi. I think you said Nairobi. You said
Yes.
Sweden, and I don't know if there was another one in there, but
Mexico
yeah,
City. Yeah.
Mexico City. How
Yep.
great is that? So wonderful.
Yeah. So next up, we have a question about promotional giveaways. So one author mentioned you can promote your book through a free book giveaway on Audible. So do you know how or if authors get paid for promotional giveaways like this?
I unfortunately, that's a question I don't know. I'm not that familiar with Audible and how they work. it may depend on how it's distributed, whether there's a royalty or not. I don't know, unfortunately. Sorry.
All right,
That one
thank you.
that one I'm stumped on.
Yeah. Well, we don't have any more questions right now.
Okay.
So Keith, do you have any final words or advice for our attendees today?
No, well, first of all, just thank you for everyone for attending. Again, very exciting that we have people from all over the world. The ALC is a resource for you that you can get questions answered no matter where you're at in your journey. And let me just tell you one more story from that Florida Writers Conference. So it was either the first or second year that I was there. The director came up to me right before breakfast on Saturday morning and said, "Would you like to talk about the Author Learning Center in front of our attendees?" I said, "Sure." She goes, "Okay, well, I need you to come up to the stage in 15 minutes, and I'm only going to give you 3 minutes." So I said, "Okay," and so I thought I got 15 minutes to prepare 3 minutes. So I walked up to the stage, and there was probably 400, 500, maybe 600 people. If you've ever been to Writers Conference, the only time everyone is ever together is at meals because otherwise they're dispersed to different workshops and tracks. And so I stood up at the podium and I asked a question of those in attendance. I said, "What questions are you here to get answered at this writers conference?" And different people raised their hands and said, "Oh, I want to find out can I get an agent, or I want to find out how to do social media." And I said, "You know what? Chances are the questions that you have are going to get answered at this conference because number one, it's a great faculty, it's a well-run conference." I said, "But let me ask you a question. A month from now, when you have a question, where are you going to go for the answer? 2 months from now, when you have a question that you didn't even know you would ask, where are you going to go for that answer?" And I said, "That's what the Author Learning Center is for." So I'm so glad and so pleased that you're able to join this webinar. But what I really hope you'll take away is that we're a resource for you throughout your journey, no matter what country you're in. And we want to see you reach your goals, both from a writing standpoint and a publishing standpoint and a marketing standpoint. And that's what we're here for. And so hopefully this overview gives you a way to think about it, but I really hope that you'll use the ALC the way it's intended, which is to be a resource for you along your journey as an author.
All right, thank you so much.